In this module, we'll be looking at the physical development during infancy. It'll be broken up into two separate modules. On this one, we'll focus on the body and the brain. The characteristics described in this slide focus specifically on children that are born in the United States. As you can see, the average length of infants upon completion is of 32 inches, and that's a 50% growth since birth. And also in weight, we see that there's a tripling of that. As you may remember, weight and growth is essential to fight off bacteria, as baby fat is essential for that, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in detail. The growth, contrary to what was believed before the 1990s, we used to think that it used to occur on a gradual basis. We now know that growth occurs in what's known as spurts, and a growth spurt can be a very subtle or very drastic spurt. There's been cases, and based on a study that was done in 1993, in which individuals did not grow at all within 7 to 63 days, but sometimes within just one day alone they would grow half an inch, which is a very drastic growth within a short period of time. This was typically noticed or brought with discomfort the night before. Typically parents who would report on children, they would say that maybe they had had a difficult time the night before putting them to bed, or that the child was crying a lot, and it is believed that the discomfort may have come from the stretching of the bones and of the adjustment in their body. Once again, baby fat is important and essential for the well-functioning of the body of a child, of an infant. When we are in the first 12 months of our lives, we find that the baby fat would be at its highest point at the 9th month of our lives. And this would be essential, again, in maintaining a constant body temperature. As you and I get older and our brain begins to function and take on its tasks, we see that the hypothalamus kicks in and allows us to maintain the constant body temperature that we need. Well, with children, although the hypothalamus is already in place, it is not yet functioning as it should be with an adult. So they rely a lot on the baby fat for the child to be able to maintain constant body temperature. Any severe fluctuations of the temperature, again, can bring about illness and vulnerability to different types of disease. The baby fat begins to disappear in toddlerhood, and that is after the 12th month. And that typically the tapering of the baby fat will continue into the middle childhood. One of the things we find is that with more muscle, again, we seem to have a loss of fat. And that is true not only with babies, but with adults as well. Individuals who sometimes struggle to keep weight off, they are encouraged to gain muscle. You don't have to develop a muscular body per se that's noticeable, but the more muscle tissue we have, the lower the amount of fat that we tend to have. Now, the muscle tissue increases during infancy, but it's very, very slow. Our ability to do things as far as walking and crawling is possible thanks to the development of the muscle. But we know that it is very abstract and very rough, and it does not necessarily bring about smooth movements or motor functions. That typically is seen later in life, but we know that the muscle tissue growth would peak in adolescence. One of the most important parts of our body that is often assessed and measured with regularity is our head. And the way we measure our head is basically by looking at the skull. Now, the skull, which protects the brain from injuries, as well as many other layers that we won't discuss in this class, this is supposed to adapt to the brain size and the growth that is seen after you and I are born. And the way the skull adapts to this growth of the brain is by leaving about gaps in the skull. These gaps are basically called fontanelles, and we are born with 6 of them, that serve many purposes. During birth, these gaps allow for the delivery through the birth canal to basically close a little bit and make it a little bit easier on mother and child to be able to go through this tight space. With time, once we are born, these begin to gradually shrink, and typically these are filled in by the second year. However, these fontanelles, though filled, they're not completely connected and solid into our skull and making it one whole skull until adolescence. So once again, these fontanelles, which are these gaps that are found in our skull when we are born, gradually throughout life begin to be filled and eventually enclose completely our brain by adolescence. Now that we understand some of the specifics of the body, including the skull, we will be looking at the way our brains develop. We will be looking at it from a microscopic level, and that basically has to do with understanding neurons and the cells, some of the cells that are part of that. And then we'll zoom out and focus on the larger level of the brain, which would be assessing the cerebral cortex and the different types of lobes that are part of our brain. When we think at the microscopic level of our brain, we understand that it is made up of billions of cells, and these cells are called neurons. These are specialized cells that communicate with one another, do store and transmit information, and this information transmission basically allows us to speak, it allows us to think, it allows us to feel, and that basically is the control panel of our body. Now, the neurons are made up of different types and pieces throughout, and we'll be looking at what these do here. The dendrites, the axon, the terminal buttons, and then the soma of the body, as well as the myelination. You guys could see the description here, but I'll be focusing on the picture in a bit and describing what each of these do in detail. Here I describe a few of the other structures of the neuron, as mentioned, terminal buttons and myelin sheath, but again, I will be discussing those as I show the picture on the next slide. Here you can see the structure of the neuron, and here at the very top we have the dendrites. The dendrites are these branch-like fibers that are receiving signals from the other neurons. These branches are like antennas for a cell phone. If you look back to older cell phones, you used to be able to stick out an antenna and get a better signal. That's what the dendrites do. They receive information that come from other neurons, and once they receive the information, it goes over to the soma, or the body of the cell. The soma basically contains a nucleus, which you can see in the center, and in there, of course, is your DNA. So your DNA is what you inherited from your parents, as you may remember from previous chapters. That information as to whether it affects your personality and the way you think, and depression and anxiety, all those things are basically in here, and your cell will behave in a way that's consistent with what you inherited. Once you get a message that would come from another neuron that would be over here at the very top, for example, then the dendrite receives it, and then it sends the information down through the axon. The axon is this beige-like thing that is inside, and it's kind of like the tunnel through where the impulse or the message is traveling through. Now, once it reaches the very end, then it reaches what's known as the terminal buttons. And these terminal buttons basically send out the information to another neuron that would be receiving it from on the other end, with dendrites as well, as we see at the top. Now, in addition to understanding this, we need to understand that the myelination of a cell, specifically the axon, is this blue pockets of fat and protein. Myelin sheath is basically essential for protecting the axon to make sure that the neural impulse travels correctly. And in addition to that, they also are used to expedite a message or an impulse. By expediting something, we mean we use it more so sometimes for emergency situations. So if I were to put my hand on a hot stove, thinking that it was off and cold, but it turns out that it's really hot, then I would require an immediate reaction, otherwise I could sustain some severe injuries. So there's a higher level of myelination that is reserved for emergency situations, and that is what is seen here through the myelination on the axon. Overall, I want you to understand that our brain and our nervous system is made up of billions and billions of these neurons, and it is a communication between them that allows us to take a simple step, to raise our hand in class, to be able to eat. All that is made possible through that. There are individuals who sustained injuries to the brain, like a stroke, and unfortunately, sometimes depending on what part of the brain was affected, they lose their ability to do things such as eating, such as moving, or sometimes their thoughts alone are impaired. One of the interesting and newly discovered neurons are the mirror neurons. And mirror neurons are specialized cells that are believed to be at the root of empathy and imitation. What we find is that if you've ever been at a movie theater or watching a movie and you feel like crying when you see one of the characters crying in the movie, the argument is that the mirror neurons would be involved in making you imitate whatever sensation you believe the character is experiencing. This is believed to also help us understand other people's intentions, as we could probably see ourselves doing something similar if we were to be in a similar situation. Here you can see an example of imitation taking place at very young ages. This infant, when exposed to someone who's sticking out the tongue, begins to also imitate, and the argument is that this is more of a reflexive response. They're not volunteering to do that, they just simply imitate. When you see that the person is doing opening the mouth, they also do the same thing. In fact, for some researchers, the mirror neurons are believed to be involved in the whole yawning contagion effect, which is that when you see someone yawning, you would then have the need or the sensation of wanting to yawn as well. And that again is believed to be in part due to mirror neurons. Here you see a different depiction of a neuron or two neurons than what we saw earlier. Earlier you saw a very detailed one with dendrites, which, if you remember, those are involved in receiving information. Well, here you see the dendrites that are very, very tiny here, and this right here, this whole thing would be a dendrite. Now, the neuron that is sending the information is this one, and it is going to be received by this one over here. So this is neuron number 1, the bottom neuron number 2. The neurons are not physically connected to one another. The way they communicate is through a chemical interaction that exists between the two. As you can see at the top in this depiction here in the center of the screen, there are these little chemicals that within the neuron travel in electrical form. However, once they reach and the vesicle in here opens up, they become chemicals. And it is in the synapse here that the neurons are able to communicate with one another. So whenever you hear of individuals describing that their chemistry was compatible with their romantic partner, we're talking about a release of neurotransmitters, these chemicals, that made it easier for them to communicate. Now, are they always going to have that stability? No. There are cases where, because of a bad day, because of a traumatic event, because of a loss of a loved one, our chemistry would be off. And sometimes, even though you may be compatible with someone, you may not necessarily click and bond and communicate well. And this is believed to be due to the fact that there have been some changes in our chemistry in our brain. That chemistry, again, would be found at the synapse, or also known as synaptic gaps. During infancy, you and I are making use of our senses and our motor skills, whatever we have, to try to understand the world, to try to adjust to a new environment. We used to be in an enclosed environment in the womb, and suddenly now there's a lot of colors, there's a lot of light, there's a lot of noise that we were not used to. And because of the exposure to all these different stimuli, the synaptic connections begin to increase rapidly during infancy and toddlerhood. Synapses and synaptic connections are essential for us to be able to make sense of life. You and I know that if the traffic light turns green, we know that it means we could go ahead. If the light turns red, we know we need to stop. That is information that has been processed in our brain, and we now know it as second nature because of synaptic connections. If somebody's never been exposed to that, then those synaptic connections would not be there, and they would then be vulnerable to being run over or crashing in an accident. So synaptic connections are essential for us to be able to understand the world. And again, they are made due to environmental stimuli. Now, synaptic pruning, which is when we lose the synaptic connections, is also a threat during infancy, and that is going to occur if we are not stimulated after birth. So if a child is born and the parents, rather than speaking to them, rather than caressing, rather than feeding, rather than providing stimulation, they neglect, then the child, rather than making new synaptic connections, is likely to experience something that's called synaptic pruning. And that would be thought of, and you will remember this throughout the rest of the term, as use it or lose it. Our brain is that way. If you do not stimulate it positively, it's not that it won't make growth. You may lose your ability to understand or to be able to utilize that. Think of, again, the example we provided in a previous slide about learning a new language at different ages. When you and I are young, if exposed to a foreign language, we would be very capable of understanding, learning, and even the pronunciation being as close as possible or almost identical to a native speaker of that language. But if we do not get exposed to that, then we start losing those synaptic connections, and if we try to pick it up later in life, we may not master that particular skill. Once again, it is important for you to know that inside the neuron, which is basically from the dendrites to the terminal button, the messages travel in electrical form. However, once they reach the synapse, and they are there communicating with another one, then they travel in chemical form. So again, if I may attempt to do this over here, you have a neuron with the terminal buttons here, and as long as it's within the neuron, then it's traveling in an electrical form. However, once you have another neuron here that's sending a message, and then another neuron that's receiving a message, then the information here would be in chemical form. Those chemicals that are found at our synaptic gaps are known as neurotransmitters. These are multi-talented agents that carry messages across the synapse to a receiving neuron. For the most part, we have two types of neurotransmitters. You have those that excite us and increase the likelihood that the receiving neuron will fire. And we have inhibitory, which are those that decrease the likelihood that a receiving neuron will fire. An excitatory message basically increases the likelihood that a behavior will occur. If you have a car that has a faulty alarm system and it goes off every other minute, then as you hear the alarm go off, you would probably not get alarmed, thinking that it's just, again, a false alarm. And that would decrease the likelihood that you would get up and run to see what is going on with your car. But if you don't have a car with a faulty alarm system and you hear the alarm go off, then more than likely, the minute you hear the alarm, you would get excited and move your body so that you could go see what is occurring with your car. That's the difference between excitatory and inhibitory messages. Whenever you are invited to go have lunch with someone, if you feel hungry and if you like this person, then the invitation alone, which is processed in your brain, will probably trigger an excitatory response. Meaning you may say, sure, why not? Let's go have lunch. However, if you are not hungry or if you don't like this person, then even though you process the same invitation to go have lunch, it may then decrease the likelihood that you'll have a chain reaction for you to go have lunch with this person. Another important aspect of neurotransmitters and neurons and the way they work is something that was discovered in the 1960s, and that is reuptake. Now, reuptake is basically the reabsorption by the terminal button of neurotransmitters that were not absorbed. Now, if you have an excitatory message, then whatever was sent from this neuron over here was received by the neuron at the bottom. That's an excitatory response. It just went from here and it continued and it goes on to the next one and the next one. However, if you do not have a receiving neuron here, then there is a blockage here, for example. And this blockage here would create something that's known as a flood or as a rush of neurotransmitters here at the synaptic gap. This rush and this flood that is seen there can bring about drastic changes in our behavior and our thought process. In fact, this is what's at the root of understanding what effect drugs have on our behavior. If you see someone that is under the influence of caffeine or that has just consumed a large amount of sugar, or who did an illegal substance like speed or meth, you find that these individuals' behaviors will change. And the reason why is because there was a surplus, there was a lot of flooding of dopamine that is all over the synapse. Since the neurotransmitter, the neuron at the bottom is not receiving it, what the neuron on top does, what this neuron here does, is that it tries to reabsorb whatever neurotransmitter it had just sent. And that's what we call reuptake. Reuptake is important to understand because its understanding led to the development of drugs to treat different psychological disorders. For example, depression. Depression is basically known as a change in our chemistry in our brain. When someone is happy, or if not happy, then definitely not sad or depressed, then they have an adequate amount of a neurotransmitter called serotonin. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that is involved in our mood and our state of mind. And the understanding of the effect of serotonin in our behavior and in our thought process led to the development of an antidepressant called SSRI. SSRI stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitors. And as you can see here, it basically tries to stop the natural process of reuptake so that we can be left with higher amounts of serotonin in our synaptic gap. So here we have, if I may try to illustrate someone who is depressed, the neurotransmitter at the bottom is that which is supposed to receive serotonin. However, when someone is depressed, they have a small amount of serotonin. We'll call it just a few of these here, serotonin. Whatever little serotonin is in there, because we are depressed, and rather than having an excitatory message that will allow the flow of the impulse to go down, they block it. There's a blockage of the neuron so that it will not receive the little bit of serotonin that's there. Whenever we have someone who is happy, they have neurons similar to us, but instead of having a little bit of serotonin, they have a lot of serotonin. What we need to do, and what the whole purpose of the SSRIs is to be able to keep serotonin in the synaptic gap. That would allow us to feel a little bit happier. There is a deficiency at the synapse of serotonin. However, because of the cell's immediate response to surplus of neurotransmitter that was not absorbed is to reabsorb it, then with the SSRIs is that it blocks the reabsorption by this other one here, therefore allowing for more serotonin to be flowing through here and thereby improving our mood. Here you see different neurotransmitters and their involvement or association with different behavior disorders. As you can see, dopamine is one that is involved in movement control, pleasure and reward, and attention. Not surprisingly, this is what is secreted in large amounts when individuals consume drugs, and that's why they feel a sense of satisfaction. Serotonin, as mentioned in the previous slide, focuses on mood and eating and sleeping and pain. Not surprisingly, again, whenever someone is depressed, they either have insomnia or hypersomnia. Insomnia being the inability to sleep or that they sleep too much. Also, someone who is likely to be depressed could either stop eating or eat excessively. And also with pain, we find that someone who is depressed is likely to experience more pain and have lower tolerance of that. Endorphins is another popular one that is located in the brain and the spinal cord, and this is involved in pain suppression and pleasurable feelings and appetites and placebos. So these neurotransmitters work together in tandem and collectively bring about an experience for you, depending on the behaviors you engage in. Let's do a quick recap of some of the things that we just covered. True or false? The terminal buttons are the parts of the neuron that receive the impulses. If you answer true to that, you are wrong. The terminal buttons is the end of the neuron which sends out messages. The correct answer would be dendrites. Without looking through your notes, can you think of the specialized neuron that is involved in imitation and empathy? If you answered mirror neurons, you are correct. True or false? The fontanelles in our skull aren't fully closed until adulthood. The answer to this is false. They are closed by adolescence. A child who is not exposed to different environmental stimuli in infancy doesn't run a risk of anything at all, meaning they will develop as many synaptic connections as the one who is exposed to a lot of different experiences. True or false? That answer would be false. As you may remember, synaptic connections are only made possible due to exposure to different stimuli, and if we do not expose ourselves to that, then we run the risk of synaptic pruning, which, as you may remember, may be use it or lose it.